The wind howled across the Montana plains like a living thing, hungry and merciless. Jake McCready pulled his hat down lower, but it did little good against the assault of ice and snow that seemed to come from every direction at once. He'd been riding for 3 days, tracking a small herd of stolen cattle when the weather turned. What started as gentle flurries that morning had transformed into a full-blown blizzard by afternoon, the kind that old-timers whispered about in saloons, the kind that buried entire wagon trains, and wasn't discovered until spring thaw. "Come on, Rufus," Jake called to his donkey, though his voice was nearly stolen by the wind. "We gotta find shelter, old friend," Rufus brayed in response, a sound of protest and agreement all at once. The sturdy gray donkey had been Jake's companion for 7 years, bought from a Mexican trader in El Paso when Rufus was just a colt. While other cowboys laughed at Jake for choosing a donkey over a horse, Rufus had proven himself time and again. He was sure-footed in rocky terrain, could carry twice what a horse could manage, and had a temperament that stayed calm when horses would panic. Right now, though, even Rufus seemed uncertain, his ears pinned back against the stinging snow. Jake squinted through the white curtain that surrounded them, trying to make out any landmark, any hint of where they might be. He'd lost the trail hours ago. Hell, he'd lost any sense of direction 30 minutes after that. The sun was somewhere up there, he supposed, but the clouds were so thick and the snow so heavy that it might as well have been midnight instead of mid-afternoon. His fingers were going numb inside his gloves. He flexed them, trying to keep the blood flowing. The cold was seeping through his sheepskin coat, through his wool shirt, through everything until it settled into his bones. He'd faced cold before plenty of times, but this was different. This cold had teeth. "We need shelter," he said again, more to himself than to Rufus. "We need it now." As if in answer to his words, Rufus suddenly stopped walking. Jake, head bent against the wind, nearly walked into the donkey's hindquarters. "What is it, boy? What you find?" Rufus stamped his feet and brayed again, more insistently this time. Jake moved alongside him, following the donkey's gaze. At first, he saw nothing but white. Then, like a ghost materializing from fog, he saw it, a dark shape, angular and solid, barely visible through the snow. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake breathed. It was a structure of some kind. As they moved closer, fighting against the wind with every step, Jake could make out more details. It was a small stone hut, maybe 12 feet square, with walls built from rough, cut granite stones fitted together without mortar. The roof appeared to be made of timber and sod, sagging slightly in the middle, but intact. There was a single wooden door, weathered gray by years of sun and snow, and one small window with shutters closed tight. Jake had never seen this hut before, which was strange. He'd been working this territory for 5 years, and thought he knew every lined shack, every abandoned cabin, every prospector's claim for 50 miles in any direction. But here was this stone hut, sitting alone on the plain like it had grown up from the earth itself. "Ain't gonna question our luck," Jake muttered. He led Rufus around the side of the hut, looking for some kind of shelter for the animal. Behind the main structure, he found a small lean-to built against the back wall, open on one side but providing at least some protection from the wind. There was even a bit of old hay scattered on the ground, dry and dusty but better than nothing. "You'll be all right here, boy," Jake said, running his hand down Rufus's nose. The donkey's fur was crusted with ice. "I'll check inside, make sure it's safe, then I'll come back and give you a proper rub-down." He unsaddled Rufus quickly, his fingers clumsy with cold, and hung the saddle over a support beam in the lean-to. Then he made his way back around to the front door. The door had no lock, just an iron latch that lifted easily despite the rust. Jake pushed, and the door swung inward, with a groan of old hinges. He stepped inside quickly and pulled the door shut behind him, grateful to be out of the wind, even if the interior was nearly as cold as the outside. Darkness swallowed him. Jake stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. There was a stone fireplace against the far wall, a blessing if ever he saw one. A rough wooden table stood in the center of the room, with 2 chairs tucked beneath it. Against one wall was a cot with what looked like a wool blanket folded at its foot. Shelves lined another wall, and Jake could make out various shapes upon them: cans, bottles, boxes. But it was what he saw in the corner that made him freeze. A man was sitting there, perfectly still, slumped in a wooden rocking chair. Jake's hand went to his gun before he could think. "Hello?" he called out. "Sir?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't react at all. Jake took a step closer, then another. The light from the window, dim as it was, fell across the figure in the chair, and Jake felt his stomach turn. The man was dead, had been for some time, by the look of him. He was dressed in simple clothes, wool pants, a flannel shirt, suspenders. His skin was like leather, dried and preserved by the cold, dry air of the hut. His eyes were closed, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if he'd simply fallen asleep and never woken up. His hands rested on the arms of the rocking chair, relaxed and natural. On his lap was an open book. Jake removed his hat, a gesture of respect. "Sorry to intrude, friend," he said quietly. He stood there for a long moment, uncertain what to do. The Christian thing would be to take the body outside, but in this weather that was impossible. Besides, the man looked peaceful where he was. He could stay in his chair a while longer. Jake turned his attention to more practical matters. He needed to get a fire going before he lost all feeling in his extremities. He moved to the fireplace and found it laid with logs and kindling, as if someone had prepared it and then never lit it. Beside the hearth was a tin box. Jake opened it and found matches, dry and ready. Within minutes, he had a fire crackling in the hearth. The warmth spread slowly through the small space, and Jake sighed with relief. He held his hands toward the flames, flexing his fingers as feeling gradually returned. Once he could feel his hands again, Jake went back outside to check on Rufus. The donkey was standing with his back to the wind, head lowered but alert. Jake gave him a quick rub-down with a relatively dry saddle blanket, clearing off the worst of the ice and snow. "I'll bring you some water in a bit," Jake promised, "and maybe some of whatever's on those shelves, if it's fit for eating." Back inside, Jake shut the door firmly and turned to survey his shelter properly. He tried not to look at the dead man, but it was impossible to ignore him entirely. The corpse sat in the corner like a silent witness. Jake went to the shelves and examined what was there. To his surprise, he found quite a stockpile. There were cans of beans and tomatoes, jars of preserved vegetables, a tin of coffee, a bag of rice that had hardened into a solid block, several bottles of whiskey, and even a few cans of peaches. Whoever this man had been, he'd prepared himself for a long winter. Jake took down a can of beans and a bottle of whiskey. He found a pot hanging near the fireplace and a manual can opener on the table. Soon he had the beans warming by the fire. He took a long pull from the whiskey bottle, feeling it burn its way down his throat and into his belly, spreading warmth from the inside. As he waited for his meager supper to heat, Jake's curiosity got the better of him. He approached the dead man's chair slowly, respectfully. Up close, he could see that the man had been perhaps 60 years old when he died. His hair was gray, his face lined with age and weather. He wore no wedding ring. There was something peaceful about him, something that suggested he'd accepted his fate. The book on his lap was a journal, bound in leather and filled with handwriting. Jake hesitated, then carefully picked it up. The dead man wouldn't mind, he reasoned, and if there was family to be notified, the journal might contain names and addresses. Jake carried the journal to the table and sat down. The last entry was dated March 15, 1882. That was nearly 2 years ago. Jake flipped back to the first page and began to read. My name is Samuel Brennan. The journal began in neat, careful script. I am writing this account in the hope that someone might find it and understand what happened here. If you are reading this, then I am likely dead, and for that I apologize. It is not pleasant to share a room with a corpse, but I assure you I am harmless now. Despite the grimness of the situation, Jake found himself smiling slightly at the man's dry humor. The journal went on to explain that Samuel Brennan had been a surveyor from Boston who came west in 175 to map railroad routes. He'd built this hut as a base camp for his work in the area. For years, he'd spent winters here, traveling back to civilization each spring with his maps and reports. But this winter, Samuel wrote, I made a terrible mistake. I waited too long to leave. The first snow came in early October, and I thought, as I always do, that I would leave in another week or two. But the snow kept coming, and soon the passes were closed. I realized I was trapped. Jake flipped through the pages, reading Samuel's account of that long winter. The man had been alone, completely cut off from the world, surviving on his stockpiled supplies. At first, his entries were matter of fact, documenting the weather and his daily routine. But as the weeks wore on, the loneliness began to seep through the words. January 10, one entry read, I have not heard a human voice in 3 months except my own. I find myself talking to the walls, to the fire, to the shadows. I wonder if this is the beginning of madness, or merely an adaptation to solitude. Jake paused in his reading to check on his beans. They were bubbling now, and he used a cloth to pull the pot from the fire. He ate directly from the pot, the beans scalding his tongue but warming his insides. He followed it with another pull from the whiskey bottle. As he ate, Jake continued reading. Samuel Brennan's journal revealed a man of education and intelligence, but also a man gradually coming apart at the seams. The isolation was destroying him piece by piece. February 3, another entry read, I have begun to see things. A woman stands in the corner sometimes, watching me. I know she is not real, and yet she is so vivid I could swear she breathes. She never speaks, only watches with sad eyes. I have named her Margaret, after my mother. Jake glanced involuntarily at the corner where the dead man sat. Had Samuel seen ghosts there? Was that woman still there, invisible but present? Jake shivered and moved his chair slightly closer to the fire. The entries became more sporadic as February wore into March. Samuel's handwriting, once so neat and precise, began to waver and slant across the pages. He wrote of hearing voices, of seeing figures moving outside the window in the snow. He wrote of terrible dreams where he was buried alive, where he clawed at frozen earth with frozen fingers. March 12, read an entry near the end. I understand now that I will not leave this place. The snow has finally stopped, but I am too weak to make the journey. My food supplies are nearly gone. I have perhaps a week left, maybe 2, if I am careful. I am not afraid. Death seems like a friend now, a warm presence waiting to embrace me. I am tired, so very tired. I think I will sleep soon, and perhaps I will not wake up. That would be all right. That would be just fine. There were 2 more entries after that. One was dated March 14, and consisted of a single sentence: "Margaret is here with me. We are together now." The final entry, dated March 15, was harder to read, the words barely legible. "Sleep now. Peace at last. To whoever finds this, I am sorry for the inconvenience. Live well. Remember me if you can." Samuel Brennan, surveyor, born December 8, 1822, died this day in the year of our Lord 1882. I was loved once, and I loved in return. That is enough. Jake set the journal down slowly. He looked over at Samuel Brennan sitting in his rocking chair, that peaceful expression on his leathered face. The man had died alone, but with dignity. He'd known it was coming, and had faced it with courage. "I'll remember you, Mr. Brennan," Jake said aloud. "I promise you that." Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the stone hut, Jake felt strangely at peace. He found blankets in a chest by the bed and made himself as comfortable as possible on the cot. He kept the fire burning, occasionally adding logs from the woodpile beside the hearth. As night fell and darkness pressed against the shuttered window, Jake lay on the cot and thought about Samuel Brennan's words. The man had died alone, yes, but he'd lived first. He'd come west to chase adventure, to do important work, to see things most Boston surveyors never dreamed of. He'd built this hut with his own hands, had survived harsh winters, had mapped unknown territory, and in the end, he'd faced death with open eyes and no illusions. There was something admirable in that. Jake must have dozed off, because he woke suddenly to the sound of movement. His hand went to his gun, and he sat up quickly, his heart pounding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely any light. Then he heard it again, a gentle creaking sound, the rocking chair. Jake's blood ran cold. He stared into the darkness of the corner where Samuel Brennan sat, but he couldn't make out any details. The creaking came again, slow and rhythmic, as if someone was rocking back and forth. "Mr. Brennan," Jake called out, his voice embarrassingly shaky. The creaking stopped. Silence filled the hut, broken only by the howl of the wind outside. Jake fumbled for matches and lit the oil lamp he'd seen on the table earlier. Golden light flooded the room, and Jake looked immediately toward the corner. Samuel Brennan sat exactly as he had before, perfectly still, his dead eyes closed, his hands resting on the arms of the chair. The chair itself was motionless. Jake let out a long breath. The wind, he told himself. The wind had gotten in somehow. A draft had moved the chair. That was all, but even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. There had been no draft. The door was shut tight, the window shuttered. The rocking had been too deliberate, too rhythmic. Jake sat on the edge of the cot, holding the lamp, watching the corner. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Eventually, Jake's rational mind reasserted itself. He was tired, half, drunk on whiskey, spooked by the journal and the circumstances. He'd imagined it or half dreamed it, that was all. He set the lamp back on the table, added wood to the fire, and lay back down. This time he kept his gun close at hand. Sleep came eventually, and with it, dreams. Jake dreamed he was standing outside the stone hut in the snow. A woman was there, tall and slender, with dark hair and sad eyes. She didn't speak, but she gestured toward the hut, and Jake understood she wanted him to go inside. When he did, he found Samuel Brennan sitting in his chair. But now his eyes were open, and he was smiling. "Thank you for coming," Samuel said in the dream. "I've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Jake asked. "For someone to hear the story, for someone to remember. We all want to be remembered, don't we? We all want our lives to matter, even just a little bit." "I'll remember," Jake promised. Samuel's smile widened. "Then I can rest. Tell them I wasn't afraid. Tell them I loved once, and it was real. Tell them I chose adventure over safety, and I'd make the same choice again." The woman with the sad eyes appeared beside Samuel's chair. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and he reached up to cover it with his own. They both looked at Jake with expressions of such peace and gratitude that he felt tears on his cheeks. "Go on now," Samuel said. "The storm's passing. It's time for you to go home." Jake woke to bright light streaming through the gaps in the shutters. The wind had stopped. He sat up quickly, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where he was. He looked immediately toward the corner. Samuel Brennan sat in his rocking chair, exactly as he had been, peaceful and still. Jake stood and opened the shutters. Brilliant sunshine flooded the room, reflecting off snow that covered everything in pristine white. The sky was a blue so pure and clear it almost hurt to look at. The storm had passed completely. Jake went to check on Rufus and found the donkey in good spirits, ready to move on. Jake gave him some of the grain he'd found in the hut stores and fresh water from melted snow. Then Jake went back inside one last time. He stood in front of Samuel Brennan's chair and removed his hat. "Thank you for the shelter, Mr. Brennan," he said. "And thank you for your story. I'm going to take your journal to Billings when I get there. I'll make sure your life is recorded proper. Make sure people know you were here and what you did. You won't be forgotten." He carefully gathered the journal and a few other personal effects he found. A pocket watch, a photograph of a young woman that might have been Margaret, a set of surveyor's tools. He would deliver them all to the authorities in Billings. Make sure Samuel Brennan got a proper burial come spring. Before he left, Jake took one of the blankets and carefully arranged it over Samuel's body, covering him respectfully. It seemed the least he could do. "Rest easy, friend," Jake said. He stepped outside into the brilliant morning, saddled Rufus, and set off across the snow. He looked back once at the stone hut, standing alone on the empty plain, and he could have sworn he saw two figures standing in the doorway, a man and a woman, watching him go. But when he blinked and looked again, there was nothing but the hut and the snow and the endless blue sky above. Jake kept his promise. When he reached Billings 3 days later, he went straight to the marshal's office and told them about Samuel Brennan. The journal caused quite a stir. Samuel, it turned out, had been reported missing nearly 2 years earlier, and his surveying firm in Boston had been trying to find out what happened to him. The marshal organized an expedition that spring to retrieve Samuel's body. They buried him in the Billings cemetery with a proper stone marker that read, "Samuel Brennan, 1008, 122-10882, surveyor, explorer, and man of courage. He chose adventure." Jake attended the funeral and was surprised to find several other people there. Representatives from the surveying firm, a few old cowboys who had met Samuel during his time in Montana, and an elderly woman who introduced herself as Margaret Brennan, Samuel's cousin from Boston. "He wrote about you," Jake told her, unsure how much to reveal. In his journal, he said you watched over him. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We were very close as children," she said. "I always hoped he'd come home, but I knew in my heart he belonged out here. This was where he was happy." Jake nodded. "He was, ma'am, right up to the end. He didn't regret his choices." The story of Samuel Brennan and his stone hut spread throughout Montana. For years afterward, cowboys and travelers would make detours to visit the little stone structure, paying their respects to the man who died alone but not forgotten. Some claimed they saw strange things there, heard voices, or saw figures in the windows. Others said it was just the wind and the imagination. Jake never told anyone about the rocking chair or the dreams. Some things were private, sacred even. But he never forgot Samuel Brennan, and true to his promise, he made sure others didn't forget either. Years later, when Jake was an old man himself, he would sometimes tell the story of that blizzard and the stone hut to his grandchildren. He'd talk about courage and loneliness, and the human need to be remembered. And he'd always end the story the same way. Samuel Brennan died alone, he'd say, but he lived fully. He chose his path knowing the risks, and he faced the consequences with dignity. That's all any of us can hope for in the end. And somewhere, in a stone hut on the Montana plains, maybe the wind whistled through the gaps in the walls, sounding almost like laughter, almost like peace, almost like a man and woman together at last, content in the knowledge that their story had been told, their lives had mattered, and they would not be forgotten. The storm had passed, the sun shone bright on the snow, and life, as it always does, went on.